Good evening and welcome to tonight's Tuesday, October 9th, 2018 meeting of the Noblesville Common Council. Welcome everyone. If you're available, please stand and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Johnson, would you lead us?
There are no flags.
There are no flags. All right. Well, we can pledge allegiance. Okay, it's right there. To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Mr. Ayer?
Present.
Mr. Boyce?
Present.
Mr. Hampton?
Here.
Mr. Johnson?
Here.
Mr. O'Connor?
Here.
Mr. Taylor?
Present.
Ms. Wiles?
Present.
Mr. Jensen?
Present.
Mr. President, you have a quorum.
Wonderful. Thank you. We'll move right along to the approval of minutes from the September 25th, 2018 special session.
Motion to approve?
Second.
Approved and seconded. All those in favor? 8-0. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the approval of the minutes from the September 25th, 2018 meeting.
So moved.
Second.
It's moved and seconded. All those in favor? 8-0. Thank you very much. Approval of the agenda. Ms. Wiles.
Mr. President, I would like to make a motion that we postpone items number 31-09-18 as well as number 33-09-18 to our October 23rd meeting.
There's been a motion to amend. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of the amendment? 8-0. Is there a motion to approve the agenda as amended?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor? Thank you very much. Again, anyone who's present to speak at the public hearing for those two ordinances, they will be open for public comment at the October 23rd meeting at 7 p.m. here in the council chambers. Thank you very much. Petitions and comments by citizens who are present. I have two, but I imagine you must speak at the appropriate time. Is that correct? Wonderful. If anyone else would like to speak, there are cards just outside the north door there. Please fill them out and hand them to the clerk. We'll move right along then to the mayor's report to council. Good evening, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, members of council. Been a little bit of a busy week or so since our last meeting. Dr. Niedermeyer did an excellent job, I think, at the chamber lunch on the 26th, talking about the need for the referendum, passage of the referendum, and obviously good schools make good communities, even better communities. I did visit Stony Creek for a student presentation. Second graders were asked, I had a meeting with them 2 weeks before, maybe I told you, but what's Noblesville need? And I really had second graders now. I mean, they talked, they really did a great job. I mean, ice cream, dog park, an aquarium, a museum. So I was kind of impressed, but I'm easily impressed by second graders, I guess. And Stony Creek did celebrate its 50th anniversary as an elementary school in the city of Noblesville. On Saturday the 29th, many of you were there. We had the field house grand opening. A great event, a great facility, very, very impressive, and a great addition to the city. Was at the AIM, which is the Old Cities and Towns Conference, from Monday through Wednesday. Was able to talk to the governor and many of their staff. He had all of his commissioners and head staff down there, which was a great thing to do. And then today, yesterday, we cut the ribbon for Koto Japanese Steakhouse. It is at Town Center on Tegler. Beautiful building, and they're open for business and happy to be here. They have another store in Carmel, and those are the only two in the state of Indiana. Then coming up, I will be out of the office beginning tomorrow for a few days. Regional strategy meeting with the Indy Partnership coming up. And then I do the State of the City luncheon at the chamber on Halloween. I think I said before that may be a little scary, but I guess I'll have to keep away from my humor and be a mayor. But anyway, yeah, I'm getting ready for that. So thank you very much. Any questions of me?
Any questions for the mayor?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving on to council committee reports. Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Finance Committee met October 4th. I'm going to keep my remarks very succinct because Mr. Spalding is going to cover most of this ground, but a couple things we covered, 2 projects regarding annexation, I think one of which is on our agenda here this evening, so I won't delve into that. The NYAP program was discussed. Judge Cook came in, made a presentation. We chatted a bit about it. I think the important things here, the Finance Committee recommended we keep the NYAP funding at $65,000 for 19, and then the Boys and Girls Club funding that we did 3 years ago will roll off, so we can look at doing some increases there in the next budget cycle. The recommendation from the committee on compensation was a 3% general pay increase, so that should be incorporated in the numbers that Mr. Spalding will speak to. And we did send to the council a favorable recommendation on the claims, but the rest of the meeting was basically budget discussion, so you'll hear the rest of that tonight. And with that, I'll make a recommendation. We approve the claims as submitted.
Great. Move right along to approval of claims. There's been a motion to approve.
Second?
It's been moved in second. All those in favor? 8-0. Thank you very much. Any additional council committee reports? Seeing none, we'll move right along to new ordinances for discussion. New ordinance 34-09-18. Council to consider ordinance 34-09-18, an ordinance annexing approximately 460 acres located south of East 166th Street, west of Oleo Road, north of East 156th Street, and east of Bowden Road, and resolution RC-16-18, adopting a fiscal plan.
Motion to introduce.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Good evening, Ms. Yelton.
Good evening. The item before you this evening is again a request for annexation of approximately 460 acres. As you can see by the item on the overhead projector, you know, it is bounded by 156th Street, Bowden Road, 166th Street, and Oleo Road. This particular piece of property here that is outlined in what is the pink color is currently within our corporate limits. The property's current use is agricultural, and it is currently in Wayne Township. The zoning that it currently holds is A2S, which is agricultural / subdivision district. And based on the fiscal plan that was submitted along with cost and revenues, there would be a surplus. We projected that out for a 5-year period, which is not the build out of this entire project, but there is a surplus. And with that, I will ask if you have any particular questions.
Questions of staff? On to the presenter. Want to present on this? Bueller?
For the record, my name is Steve Harden, representing the petitioner, Pulte Homes. This is 100% voluntary annexation. This is just one step in the process. We weren't planning to make any type of formal presentation other than we're happy to be annexed into the city of Fisher, or into the city of Noblesville. City of Noblesville. Let the record reflect, only Noblesville's mentioned here. So we don't have, we're getting ready, we're working through the process with the planning staff to go through the formal zoning process, which we'll introduce as we've already had at the city council in August, and we'll be working through the development plan and zoning as we move forward. But tonight we're just here for the annexation.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ayer.
Mr. Harden.
Mr.
Yes,
Harden.
I don't believe we've done one of these in the 14 and a half years
Make
I've
sure you're
been
speaking to the microphone.
on the council. We normally start with either a developer agreement or a rezone, and then we do the annexation along with the rezone. Here we don't really know what we're getting at the end game. What's the purpose of annexing ahead of time? You want to answer that, Mr. Ford?
The problem here is that there's a federal law that you cannot annex the year before a decennial census. So, and I assume that, you never assume that what the feds are thinking about, but I assume they want a fixed number when they do the census. This project, and I've sent a memo out, is one of the more complex projects. You've got Hamilton Southeastern utilities, et cetera. This would be a project that normally would take 6 or 7 months to go through the process. We do have a memorandum of understanding on annexation prepared by outside counsel for the city. It's been signed by the property owner, Whitecroft Farms. It is recorded and cross-referenced their deed. And essentially, if they do not have their development agreement and zoning in place October 31st, we can de-annex them at their expense, at the landowner's expense. So, and to give you a kind of a reference point, when we did Hamilton Town Center, we met for at least 2 to 2.5 hours every Wednesday morning for 20 months. This is not, in a lot of ways, not that complex, but it is complex. So with this recorded document, the reason we don't annex before we've got the development in place, because if we annex, we have to provide capital and non-capital services within a certain time. This agreement acknowledges that we will not be responsible for providing those capital services if we de-annex within the time frames here. So we've worked with planning and economic development. We've all got a lot of work to do on this, and rather than rush it, we want to get this, they want to get the annexation done so they can go on with the project. It does not take any of your control as the legislative body, as the body approving a development agreement, zoning, or whatever.
I understand that, but we're not, whether I annex it in now or annex it in January of 2020, doesn't make a lot of difference. There's not going to be an EAV in the ground in 2019 to speak of, but I get to take care of those 2.5 miles of roads for that year, and they're not in great shape, by the way. You travel them, I know, so we get to maintain that.
I think, Mr. Ayers, you're familiar with the term option?
Yes, I've seen one or two. Yes. Okay. Well, we've got a couple weeks to discuss it, but anyway,
Right.
that is.
It's a $370,000, $1 million investment.
But I guess that my consideration is what difference does it make whether I do it now or do it in January of 2020? We'll talk about it later. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Howard, I have a question. I know in the clawback, which I appreciate being in, and I understand the census concern, but how do we come up with the date October 31st of next year? I mean, how do we land on that date?
I didn't draft the agreement. Right. Steve Unger drafted it. I don't know that you guys picked that date. They can probably come back a few months. That's up to them.
I was just curious. I mean, you mentioned that it could take 6 to 7, and then, over a year. I just was curious as to how that was. Maybe we just picked it out. All right, cool. That's fine. All right, I just know there was a theory or something.
Can I answer one question? I didn't want to talk if I didn't have to, but I feel like I better.
Stay away from Miss Reed. She's deathly ill.
I will not breathe on the microphone. I'll talk loud enough. One thing that I realized too in this process, I know the question has been raised as to the urgency of the annexation, and one of the another challenge we have with this project is we don't have zoning jurisdiction. So unless we annex, we can't zone, and we can't zone without a development agreement. So again, it's this weird cycle that we talked about at Finance Committee. So it's not even in our planning jurisdiction right now. So annexing would allow us to move forward with the zoning process. So that's your answer.
I guess I have one more question, and I think I know the answer to it, but if we were to annex currently, I know there's the clawbacks in terms of the services that we must provide, but we wouldn't do that unless the agreement's in place. But what would we have to, over the course of the next year until that development agreement is in place, what would we have to, Mr. Ayer alluded to it in terms of the roads, but can you walk us through what we'd have to provide or what that would look like in the city for the next year?
Well, the capital or the non-capital services have to be provided within a year. So October 31st, the county is going to be required to continue to maintain those roads just as they did in Home Place for a year after the annexation. So if this was passed in November, then de-annex in November of next year, and you may want to change that October 31st a few days back just to make sure you're not cutting weeds but that is the reason, because you have 1 year to provide non-capital expenses.
And technically, if this zoning would be approved, it would be approved on the 23rd at the next, but then it wouldn't take effect for 30 days after that, right?
Right.
So
it would be a November 30th effective date.
So we should be,
No
we'd be
services
okay
during that year.
in that year.
So goose egg is what you're telling me. Got it. Thanks. That's just what I wanted to hear.
We're trying to go on the zero risk
I know, yeah.
program
You're
here.
using big words, just land on zero. All right.
Okay.
That's cool.
You don't need me for anything else, right?
No.
Okay.
Additional questions? None. We do need to vote. I will look for a motion to approve resolution RC-16-18 at this time.
So moved.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I
Sorry.
apologize. We have to do a public hearing.
Public hearing.
Nope, that was my fault. At this point in time, we will open the public hearing for 34-09-18.
President,
Mr. Ayer.
seeing no public coming forward, I move to close the public hearing.
Second.
It's moved and seconded. All those in favor of closing the public hearing? 8-0. Thank you very much. Now we will get back to where I was going with that, and I'll entertain a motion to approve resolution RC-16-18.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor? 8-0. Thank you very much. Moving right along, new ordinances for discussion. Ordinance 35-10-18. Council to consider ordinance 35-10-18, an ordinance adopting the 2019 operating budget.
Motion to introduce?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Good evening, Mr. Spalding.
Excuse me, Mr. President, members of the council. Jeff Spalding, City Controller, and I'm going to take a moment here to hook everything up. And I guess while I'm doing that, I'll apologize for my laryngitis. Tried to leave it on. Yeah, that worked too. I love this. This will be the thing that doesn't work.
No, you got it.
Yeah, but my mouse isn't working.
Could you put that one in?
I thought they both. What's that? Technology. Ah, perfect. I think. Yeah. There we go. All right, again, good evening, members of the council. Most of you, because of the process that we've undertaken, are relatively familiar with the document that I'm going to be going through here. You have a copy of the slides that are up on the screen in front of you. And I will proceed through this relatively quickly. Stop me at any moment that you want to. And, you know, we can go as deep into any topic as you would like. I will do my best to hit the high points that I think are the most relevant for the, policy decision that the budget represents. Before I go through this, though, I do want to make a special notice of a thank you to the Finance Committee, who I work with, very regularly throughout the year. And a lot of the things that we're doing in this budget are a result of discussions that I've had with that group, and I, am able to kind of work through issues with that group, get their support for some of the kind of process and accounting changes that I think are important moving forward, so that we have, good financial information to analyze. So quick note of thank you to the members of the Finance Committee for all of the support they give in this process as well. Let's see. So as with anything that you take on, there are some guiding themes. Some of these are, actually most of them are holdovers from last year's budget because the process that we're undertaking, does take a little time to work its way through. There's still significant aspects of this budget which I call right-sizing and realigning, which is basically trying to make sure that the budgets that we prepare reflect the operational goals and needs of the departments without going into kind of some of the detail as to how that kind of got, out of line or out of whack over time. We've been examining those things and just trying to make sure that, when we budget for something, it represents a true spending plan, what we need. I suppose a little example that I've heard over time is that for years and years and years, and it's relevant in this budget, but some very small amount was always budgeted for salt, even though it didn't represent the amount of salt that the street department needed to purchase, and we're trying to resolve those types of things. Realigning is another important aspect of this too, is I'm trying to make sure that all expenses both get accounted for and budgeted for in kind of the proper functional alignment, so you have good cost allocation of your financial information. And what that does, it helps fiscal transparency, it helps forecasting and planning, and it helps you get you to a position where you can focus on cost efficiency and performance metrics. Again, a good example of this, and Noblesville wasn't unique in this regard, but oftentimes there are costs that are paid for out of a central location because they maybe it's simpler from an accounts payable standpoint, but it doesn't reflect the true functional allocation of what you're doing, so that you're not capturing the full cost of operations within departmental budgets. There's an example of this in this budget. There's the countywide contract we have for 911 dispatch, as well as some public safety radio equipment. For years, that was budgeted and paid for centrally out of the Board of Works budget, and I've allocated that cost to police and fire, and there's other things like that, but that's the right size and realign. Another point, I made this last year, I'm making it again this year because I think it's an important point. Doing a job well costs less than doing it cheaply. I think that's a particularly relevant factor as we're a growing community with increasing public expectations and demands, and it is very easy to kind of go with the conventional wisdom. Hey, I've got a budget, I've got financial data. The conventional wisdom is you want those numbers to get smaller rather than bigger, and you definitely don't want to waste any money, but you do want to make sure you're investing money in the things that you need to get done, and you do them well. And then the other guiding theme is modernizing the financial processes continues. Again, I mentioned my work with the Finance Committee on this, but as we do this, as I make the changes to the accounting system and the budget, the alignment of costs and expenditures, that's going to make year-over-year comparisons a little difficult for a couple cycles, but once we get on the right cycle, it'll make those comparisons that folks want to do much easier going forward and much more relevant. Another important thing to understand about this budget and the numbers that we will be going through is there's a pretty significant amount of state law around the budget process for municipalities and how you have to build out the information, report it publicly, and those types of things. So consequently, there's a requirement that you submit a budget into this state system called the Indiana Gateway at least 10 days prior to your first public meeting on the budget, which we're having tonight. So that was done. That was submitted timely into the Gateway system. It generates this document that becomes your official introduced budget. But just for clarification of the committee members, as we continue to discuss things, both from the date that was submitted, which was September 28th, through the introduction of the budget today and also through the adoption on the 23rd, there may still be some more discussion and debate, but the numbers that you're going to see tonight all align with what was submitted on September 28th, even though we've had some discussions about some changes since then, and I'll address those in the presentation, but they all align with what was submitted into Gateway. I think it's important to try to visually grasp, how your money is spent and allocated. So here's the first pie chart. I've taken all of our expenses for the civil city budget, and again, for those that aren't aware, the civil city is what is kind of traditionally the things you think of as the city departments. The utility is not included in the civil city budget. The redevelopment district and the TIF funds, that's not part of the civil city budget. It's the main core operating parts of the city that we're talking about here. And as you can see, that the proposed budget's just a little over 69 million, and it gets allocated into these different types of expenditures. There's general operating expenditures. The restricted operating expenditures there are some city funds that have a more limited or restricted use, like the Parks Fund, the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund, those types of things, but you still have operating costs that come out of those funds. Then there's some pension obligations that we have. There are some capital project funds that have restrictions on them that we still fund certain expenses out of. And then finally, there's debt service that is civil city related debt service. It's not redevelopment district, economic development debt service. It's, and we'll talk about it more, but it's, more of your traditional city facilities like City Hall, that type of thing. This just is a comparison of the 2019 base budget versus the 2019 requested budget. And again, a quick reminder, the base budget is essentially the 2018 budget, but not exactly the same as the 2018 budget. Some of this right sizing and realigning causes you to adjust the base. And then here it is in numbers, and I apologize, this document's a little tough to read, and this is appropriations by fund. We'll be looking at things both by fund and by department. The state looks at things by fund, and so you typically will see your city financial information presented that way, but from a functional standpoint, it makes more sense to look at things by department. But when we're interacting with the state and trying to meet their requirements, you have to present things by fund. I will draw folks' attention to two numbers. Let's see if this is turned on. Right here, this is the raw budget increase of 7%. So it's this 69.2, 69.3 versus the base of 64.7. But what you need to understand is, what's included in there, and oftentimes some of your, year-over-year numbers don't give you a kind of a good reflection of what's going on underneath the surface. And that's where, if you see the next number down here, I've made a number of adjustments to normalize year-over-year changes, and we'll get a little bit more into that. But when you do that normalization, you get to about a 3.3% increase in kind of ongoing expenditures. So let's dig into that a little bit more. Here's the adjustments to normalize year-over-year changes expanded out, and essentially what you see in here is adjusting out for major non-recurring costs that are included in the budget. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later in the presentation, but there are a number of items that were included in these budget request amounts that, represent one-time costs for 2019, some, major trail design and construction work. There's a significant, abnormally high request from the street department to do some restocking of the salt barns. There's some other capital improvements to city facilities, bridge redecking, some things like that. When you adjust those non-recurring costs out, you get to a 3.3% increase. Another item, just again so that the members of the council don't think I forgot about it, we've already discussed some changes to the published budget. One of the things that was included in the published budget was a $50,000 request for a 5-year economic development plan update. And since September 28th, discussions with that department director, discussions with the council, we're thinking, okay, that will be adjusted out, and that change will be made to the adopted budget. That $50,000 is still included in the numbers that you've seen before, but I just wanted folks to be aware of that. Here again, just visually, you can start to look at how your costs stack up, what your cost drivers are for the city by department instead of by fund. And obviously you can see, as with most municipalities, the primary thing we're doing is providing public safety with police and fire. And then there's, pretty significant amounts for street maintenance and street capital improvements. That's the orange area up at the top. And then the green area is parks-related expenses, which is another significant driver, and everything else is relatively small relative to those costs. This is, again, the same numbers that we talked about before. There's the 7% increase that I showed you before. You'll see these totals add up to the same numbers that you saw before. But this is just breaking the budget down by department rather than by fund, and that's just an easier way of seeing how you're allocating your resources across the various functional needs of the city. Again, this is just another way of looking at that, pie chart versus a stacked bar chart, but just a reference that you can go back, and it just helps you put some things in context. Obviously, when you look at it this way, you can see that police and fire are nearly 50% of the overall budget of the city, and this is all funds. Now, oftentimes a lot of discussion centers around the general fund because that's your primary operating fund. It's your most flexible resources. And as you can see now, the general fund budget request is $43.2 million. So it doesn't have the motor vehicle highway fund in it. So you'll notice there's no funding in here for street improvements, that type of thing. And you can see when you're looking at your general fund, obviously police and fire are an even bigger share of that budget. Here's the restricted operating funds I mentioned before, and as we talked about, the primary restricted operating funds are funds that support street maintenance, then there's funds that support parks. The listing of all these restricted operating funds is over at the bottom left-hand corner, but again, it just shows you how those monies are allocated. You have less flexibility on how you allocate those across functions because by the nature of being restricted, there's certain funds that have to be spent for certain types of expenditures. Then here's the restricted capital funds, where they are going. One of the big drivers is that of the allocation of these funds too is how they're restricted, and one of the restricted capital funds is the fire cumulative capital fund, so that money is being spent on fire department equipment and drives up that cost. The Fund 257 is the primary fund that is supporting road work. That was a special distribution of income tax money for roads. And then the other two cumulative capital funds, they have some flexibility to them, and we allocate them across various needs of departments for equipment. And then debt service, again, the debt service funds that we have in the civil city budget are listed over here to the left. And you can see what the debt is supporting. A bunch of the debt is related to road projects, but other debt is associated with city facilities, either fire facilities, parks facilities, and then what's up here listed as maintenance. It's debatable whether I allocate it to maintenance or something else, but that's the debt for City Hall. The City Hall debt has to be allocated someplace, so I allocated it to maintenance. And then another important thing to understand about your budget is, what types of things are you buying? And, your expense categories tell you, what types of things are purchased. And here's the allocation across all civil city funds. About 59% is for the 100 series, which is personal services. There's a sliver for supplies, another fairly large amount for other services and charges. And that sliver's large for probably two reasons. One is utilities are all in that large category, as well as any consulting services. So, when you're doing design work, that type of thing, bringing in engineering consultants, those types of things, those costs get categorized there. As a quick reminder, these series categories, they're not my creation. They are, required by the State Board of Accounts, in terms of how they want local units of government to account for costs. So they've established these categories, and then we operate within them. Again, as you look at the general fund, same type of breakdown, but it's how your general fund money, most of your departments that have staffing in them are funded out of the general fund. So you can see, nearly 80% of the general fund budget is personal services. When you get to the restricted operating funds, much smaller portion of that is for personnel, and that is because in some cases those restricted operating funds have at least some requirement that a portion of them be spent on capital improvements, particularly the MVH, and the LRS. That's the Local Road and Street Fund. The Local Road and Street Fund, you cannot pay for staff out of the Local Road and Street Fund. You have to use that money to maintain and improve your streets. Then when you get to the restricted capital funds, there are no dollars spent on personnel services because you can't. And the reason it's not all in the 400 series for capital outlay is because we do have some capital equipment leases that we make those lease payments out of some of these restricted capital funds. And again, under the state's accounting requirements, debt service payments, lease payments, those types of things are 300 series expenses. Uh-oh. Oh, well, all right. I didn't realize, I guess I had some...
Thanks.
Keep pushing that button.
Yeah. I had some little creativity going on in this. Let's see if that's it. There you go. Apologize for that. I guess I should have run through the slides. I thought it all would just come up. Again, another item that's always of interest in any budget request is the request for new positions. As I mentioned before, we're a growing community, growing demands. Departments are identifying various needs. We've had lots of discussions around this at some of our previous budget sessions and in the Finance Committee, but I can go through these individually, but what you can see here is there's a request for 17 new positions. Total cost, which assumes that the positions will elect health benefits and so on and so forth, is $1.3 million. And it's in most cases being driven by increasing demand for city services. And as you can see, I've sorted these by, largest to smallest number of positions being requested, so you can see what's really driving that. In most cases, it's areas where, you've got the fire department, trying to address their needs for equipment and the staffing associated with that equipment. Street Department, continually expanding needs. The Parks Department, adding a new park, those types of things. So does anybody have any question about these? All right. Then 10 positions pay adjustments.
I can probably cover those in my salary ordinance.
What we have here is you have a number of departments that are specifically requesting, instead of a new position, they're looking at alignment of duties, changing duties, expanding duties, changing the relationship in pay between various positions, trying to get those things accomplished. And these are all reflected in the salary ordinance, and that can be discussed when the salary, in more detail when the salary ordinance is presented. But in total, here's what the requests are, and the impact of those would be about $43,000. Oops. Boy. All right. Another thing that's always of interest with any budget request is, because it's a large dollar amount, is capital equipment requests. So what this list references is the major capital equipment requests that are included in this budget, across the various departments. Obviously with street and fire, they usually are the requesters of the largest vehicles. Police often needs patrol vehicles, vehicles for their investigators, that type of thing. Oops, make sure I got that right. Yep. And then other departments will have certain capital equipment requests. Parks, again, they have to maintain a lot of acreage, so they have some need for some heavy trucks and light-duty vehicles. Then maintenance equipment for the parks. Then we have, from information technology, some requests for capital equipment that's related to connectivity and IT security. And then finally, the engineering department just requesting the replacement of a couple work vehicles. And one thing I do want to draw your attention to with this list is what I've done in each case is I've listed not only what they're requesting, but also a breakdown of whether the items, how much of the items represent additions to our capital asset stock and how much are just replacements. We're not actually increasing the number of vehicles or equipment. We're just replacing worn out stuff. All right, then get this all up here. All right. Then beyond positions and equipment, there are several other notable items in this budget request that folks care about, and they represent key focus of priorities. One is the general pay increase for full-time positions, which was referenced earlier. The numbers that have been submitted assume funding for a 3% general pay increase. I think one thing that's relevant to state on the record about that is that without getting into a lot of the detail around how the state law defines and controls the growth in property tax revenues and income tax revenues, but it is worth noting that the 2019 budget is being built in an environment where the estimates for revenue growth for 2019 will be in the 3% range, despite the fact that the city is growing much faster than that, and this is a discussion we've all had. But given certain rules and constraints about the way revenue growth is defined in state law that affects municipalities, that growth doesn't always get immediately realized in your operating budget revenue, and so this 3% general pay increase is at least in line with what the revenue growth is. There's the French Creek Park startup, again, that new park being built out, and in 2019 needing to be maintained, so the Parks Department has asked for resources, both positions and other supplies and things like that for that purpose. Also, Parks did ask for significant funding related to, repairs and upkeep of park facilities, both the facilities they operate out of as well as some of the facilities that are there for the citizens to enjoy. There's also a increased request in this budget to enhance maintenance on the downtown square, which is a street department responsibility, and they've requested positions and funding for that. They've also, as demand for their services grow and they think about their workload, they've requested funding to repurpose a couple buildings at their location, to in effect remodel them so that they can be used more effectively. Then, as I referenced earlier, there is a unique, fairly large one-time expense also for restocking of the salt barn. I guess a few years back they had built up the stockpile in the salt barn, worked that down, had a fairly heavy demand this last winter as well as the winter before, and they've hit the point where they feel like they need to restock. Other notable items that we've talked about and were reflected in the numbers that I've shown you. Major capital projects are now included in this budget. In the past practice was the budget tended to focus mostly on operating costs, and then when it came time to fund a major capital project, there was either identifying of a contingency that could be pulled on or coming back to the council for funding. And my approach, which again is in the spirit of transparency, is whatever you can know about your plans for major capital projects, budget for them and include them in your budget. You recognize there's some uncertainty there, but have those amounts budgeted for, and that's one of the main things driving up the budget numbers that we saw earlier. But as I showed, those are non-recurring costs. So when you pull them out, you get a better sense of what the ongoing operating costs are growing. Another thing that's aligned with that major capital projects or budgeting for major capital projects is I've made a substantial reduction of the operating contingency funds from the past. If you'll recall, last year I made a large reduction from 17 to 18, and I'm making another large reduction from 18 to 19, primarily because as you identify more of your needs in specific budget items, there's less need for contingency funding, but contingency funding is still, just a reminder to everybody, it's still a necessary part of good, effective, best practice budgeting because there are known unknowns. And if you don't budget for those known unknowns, you can, create some problems in responding quickly to them sometimes. Another item that we've, again, talked about in previous meetings, and I think this just adds a lot of clarity and transparency. We're ending the unnecessary split budgeting for positions. There are a number of positions in the civil city, my own included, which aspects of my job, and these other 7 positions, not only support the civil city operations, but also support the utility, and the utility is a separate legal entity. And in the past, the way that had been addressed in terms of having the utility carry some of that cost was those positions would be budgeted partially from the civil city and partially from the utility, regardless of what the person's actual duties were. And that just it not only created some confusion about what the funding and the pay for the positions was, but it also created some complexity with regard to payroll. And so the approach that I've taken here is that it will be fiscally the same, but we will budget those positions within their functional operating department and then have the utility make a payment in lieu of taxes to the city to cover their cost share of those expenses. And then finally, we talked about, when I started out, I talked about realigning certain costs. A couple big ones are the public safety costs that I referenced, as well as Noblesville Youth Assistance. That's $1.1 million of costs that were shifted around within the budget. So the reason that that's a relevant point is you could, in isolation, have somebody looking at the budget numbers for the police department, fire department, or the courts, let's say, and ask some questions about, hey, why is the courts budget so much higher now than it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that type of thing. And it would look like we're spending more money on the courts when in fact we have just allocated an expense that the city has been incurring and saying operationally, functionally, it fits with the court, it fits with their duty and role. So it's really a fiscally neutral action, but can create some confusion. And with that, I'm done going through my presentation, and I'm ready to take any questions if you have some.
Mr. Spaulding, first of all, thank you for your thoroughness. At times it had us cross-eyed, but I do appreciate it. It's a heavy lift. You had, in your numbers here, it shows, with all things included, about a 7% increase in the budget. Do we have the, and you may have said it, and I may already know it, but can you tell us what our projected AV growth for this year has been?
Yes, the projected AV growth for 2019 year is 8.8%.
Okay, all right, that's helpful.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Additional questions, Mr. Spaulding?
Mr. President,
Mr.
probably
O'Connor.
more of a comment, but to your point, I mean, the 7% number is a gross number. If you take out those one-time expenses that I think Jeff did a nice job of pointing out, it aligns fairly well with, when you look at the AV growth that you just mentioned at 8.8, and we're trying to keep a little bit of a lid on what we're doing from an expense perspective, but we're a growing community, so you've got to fill these positions. We've got more road miles that we've got to maintain, and that's going to continue to be an ongoing challenge. But I think Jeff pointed it out as well, that we have challenges on the revenue side because of the constraints that we have to work within, and it's really a challenge sometimes to get around those things. So, and we're all aware of that. But despite that, this budget's been a pretty heavy lift for a lot of us, and yet I think we have something here that's going to allow us to continue to grow, to deal with the aspects of operations we need. So, thanks for all your work and patience with people like me and others. So.
Additional comments or questions, Mr. Spaulding? Mr. Johnson?
Mr. Spaulding, I'd like to take just a brief moment to thank you for everything you've done. Not to disparage anyone or anything that was going on before you got here, because they were dealing with what they had at that time. We were always trying to be as clear and transparent as we possibly could. But when Mayor Ditzler pulled you off the street and forced you to come here and work with us, he did a wonderful thing, because you have brought some new tools and mindsets to this process that we did not have before. And I think you're doing an outstanding job. For those of us in the past who were sitting in on some of these meetings, we could see it, and we go, yeah, okay, that's clear now. I get that. What you've done, though, is you've set something in motion here that the people who are not in those meetings, the citizens of Noblesville, can look at your presentation and go, oh, this makes sense. And you've done a great job of kind of helping us not just get the clarity and the transparency, but put the glasses on us and make it go, yeah, this makes sense, I get it. There's nothing being hidden, there's nothing being done wrong, and you've just done a super job with that, and appreciate all your work, because I know that you still have a lot more of this to come yet. We're only in the middle of all of this yet, and these changes. And once that we have a few of these budgets under our belt, and we have things to go back and compare it to, because it's really difficult to compare today's budgeting process that you put into motion, excuse me, to a lot of the previous stuff. And so it'll even become more clear once we get a few years down the road and a few more budgets down the road. So thank you very much for everything you're doing for us.
Thank you for those kind words.
No comments or questions, Mr. Boyce?
Mr. President, thank you. I totally agree. I think we've spent a lot of time on it, and you've done a great job with spending time on it and telling us everything that's in it and making it a lot more clear. I am struggling, and this is not personal, this is just with a budgetary, when the budget is showing numbers of going up 7% when I look at our revenue is only going up 3%. I know the AV's up 8%, but our total revenue is projected to be around 3%. And I realize the adjusted numbers are there, but if you just look at the total numbers, it just scares me. And I support the 3% increase. In pay. I'm happy for that. And I know that some of these are there, but and I know we've got some aggressive cash funds out there that we can use with the reserves. But I always look at cash as being more for capital items. That's just me. Right, because once you get them into operations, they're ongoing, and it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to lower them. So 17 positions is quite a bit. We've got council, I know, cut the budget. We cut it 0.07% from what was original. So I'm still just trying to wrap my head around the 3% up in revenue and the 7% up in operational total budget. That just is, I'm struggling with that.
Now remember, a lot of that is one-time costs, though. That is, a big part of the 7% is one-time expenses that will be tapping those cash reserves.
Additional comments? Mr. Taylor?
I kind of agree with Mr. Boyce on that, and I'm kind of looking at it as, you know, the one-time expenses is helping me a little bit with this, because it's a lot of it, as we went through for capital equipment requests, you know, if you look through this budget and say, okay, but who don't need this and who doesn't need that, it's really tough for me to cut it out. And then you get to the 17 positions and the same thing. It's like, that's a lot of positions. That's a lot of money for a long time. But then again, I look at it and go, okay, where are we going to cut it? So I agree with Mark, but I think for me, the one-time expenses is helping me a lot, because it's stuff to operate functionally, or should I say, for the citizens, we need it.
Right. Let me mention one other thing, too, that is coming. You know, Mr. Johnson mentioned there, you know, we're continuing to work this, we're continuing to improve the process. One of the things, too, that we don't have a good history of, but we will, is how much you revert from your budget, you know, what your budgeted cost versus your actual spending, and there's always going to be that gap too, and we're going to start to get to the point where we have really good information on that by functional area, and then you can start to we'll be able to present budgets that show this is what the budget increase is, but this is what we actually think the spending increase will be. And one good example of that is that as a matter of good fiscal practice, you have to budget for all positions filled the full year, because it could happen. But again, when you get your budget process very sophisticated, then you start anticipating, well, you are going to have a certain vacancy and turnover rate that you start to factor into the budget, and then you can start to see some of those types of things. So sometimes the budget numbers, a little bit more of a shock than what's truly going on underneath in terms of actual spending.
Mr. Ayer.
Jeff, did you throw a percentage number of one-time expenses, and are those one-time expenses truly one-time expenses or expenses we can anticipate 7 years down the road or 10 years down the road?
I didn't throw a percentage at it. I didn't tell you what that was. I would have to calculate it quickly. But what I did do is it's on slide number 7. I listed what they are, and then, yes, the word one-time expense, I actually, since you mentioned that, that's kind of one of my pet peeves is I don't like the term one-time expenses, but everybody uses it. I like non-recurring, and generally that means things that are not recurring every single year, but you can see the list here. There are going to be some capital needs every year, and we're going to have to get to the point where we start to understand there is a baseline of capital expenditures that will have to occur year after year, but we don't have good enough information to be able to tell you what that is. So what I've done is I've kind of defaulted to the traditional, here's the things that are in this budget that, you're not going to need to do again next year. You're not going to repurpose the street department buildings again next year after you do it this year.
But there very likely could be another list of things that
there will be, but I will tell you a good example of this, and I didn't reference it when we were going through the capital equipment list, but the capital equipment list is down substantially from last year because there were some major pieces of fire apparatus that were purchased last year that they don't need to again repurchase this year. It's down more than $2 million in terms of capital equipment items. Again, a lot of that to be leased, but right. So you do really see those things go down. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Hampton.
One thing we kicked around in the Finance Committee was this pay adjustments. There are 10 positions that are getting slightly more than the overall 3%. Are they then getting the 3% on top of that now? I know we discussed that.
When Steve Cook talks about the salary ordinance, he can delve into that a little bit more, but that, in the discussions we've had, at least with Finance Committee and the Council, it at least was clear to us that currently the intent is to have the salary ordinance reflect not both the requested pay adjustment and the general salary increase, but the preference was to have the higher of both. Now, with that, as you remember in the meeting, there is to some degree some issue that some departments may have because the specific pay adjustments are designed to accomplish a goal different than the general pay increase. So it's possible you may hear some more discussion about that going forward as the departments are trying to execute their operational goals. But currently, my understanding is that was the expectation of the council is that it would be the higher of the two as opposed to both.
Additional questions or comments? Seeing none at this point in time, we will open the public hearing for the 2019 operating budget.
Mr. President, go ahead.
Mr. O'Connor.
Seeing no one from the public coming forward, I would move to close the public hearing on 35-10-18.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor of closing the public hearing? 8-0. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Spalding. Moving along, right along here to new ordinance 36-10-18. Council to consider ordinance 36-10-18, a salary ordinance for appointed officials and employees of the city of Noblesville for 2019.
Motion to introduce.
Second.
Introduced and seconded. Mr. Cook, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. President, members of council. As Mr. Spalding had indicated in his presentation, the city has proposed a 3% cost of living adjustment for all employees citywide, and we have following the discussions with the Finance Committee regarding that adjustment compared to perhaps some key specific pay adjustments that Mr. Hampton had talked about, So we've, for the most part, have followed the council's guidance. There were a handful of changes that I apologize we were not able to make until today, which is reflected in the new version of the salary ordinance that Mrs. Ramon has just passed out. And I can go over those. That way it's at a high level. I can answer any questions and kind of let you know where we've made those adjustments. So we would respectfully request that these would be considered. So there were 5 positions in the salary ordinance where we either removed the 3% increase in favor of the specific pay increase, as Mr. Spalding had indicated, or we removed the specific pay increase to do the 3%. So that's reflected in this ordinance change. There were 4 departments, however, where we did look at the specific pay adjustment and wanted to make some additional considerations, and I can explain what those are. In the maintenance department, our facilities manager is really, it's not a department director position, but we do feel that it is equivalent to an assistant director at the street department level. So we would request that the pay would match the biweekly 2019 pay rate of that assistant director. Similarly, in planning and economic development, the assistant directors of both those departments we feel have equal job responsibilities and management duties to the assistant director in the street department. And then the last department that we would ask for this change is in the fire department, where we believe the chief, assistant chief, and deputy chief, those positions should be on pay which would be equivalent with their counterparts in the police department. So that at a high level are the changes that would be reflected in the new version. And I can answer any questions you have.
Mr. President.
Mr. O'Connor.
Steve, the maintenance, I mean, just give us an idea of what's the difference. What we were looking at in the original spin was $5,070. So I'm trying to figure out how material is the change?
I'm going to invite up Mrs. Ramon from Human Resources.
Excellent.
What was in your packets and what I passed out for you this evening, actually we did not change for the facilities manager position and the assistant director position for the planning department and economic development department, and would ask for your reconsideration. As Mr. Cook had stated, the increase for those positions were really to match what the assistant street commissioner is currently making biweekly. Currently, those 3 positions are making less than that position. However, we feel that their responsibility level and duties are equivalent to that position.
So it's the assistant director under planning.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then
The assistant director for economic development, which is on page 2 at the top.
okay. And then what was the third one?
On the first page, maintenance, the facility manager's position, that those 3 positions stay steady with the increase and match the assistant street commissioner.
So, Mrs. Ramon, so then in the estimated cost of the 10 pay adjustments that we had, originally it was going to be $43,430. With making these changes, how much does that modify that number?
That would be included in what has already been accounted for.
So go ahead, I'm sorry. So that 43,430 still
the same.
Still the same number.
Okay.
Correct, Mr.
Thank you.
Spalding. The 43,000 adjustment is, it's not something we're newly presenting. We're just asking if you would please reconsider from what we had already previously requested. When you met in finance, we were directed to either give the adjustment or the 3%, not both. But we're asking for those 3 positions that you please consider keeping them as originally presented and not decreasing from that amount, so they're matching the assistant street commissioner.
And so also that's under, I bet you it's under 10,000.
So just to make, so instead of 10 that would have that, it's 3. Would have that adjustment where they get both raises. Is that what this reflects?
Yes, it would be, we didn't really look at it like, okay, we want to adjust it plus give a cost of living adjustment. It was more of a, let's look at all of our assistant directors and see where they fall. And our assistant street commissioner is here. And then we have our assistant director of economic development and assistant director of planning and facility managers are down here. So we'd like to move them equivalent to the assistant street commissioner.
And the same would be
do a
true of the
match.
facilities manager as well.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Taylor, you have a comment?
I understand what they're saying, but I have a hard time justifying some of these being assistant street commissioner as far as responsibilities. I have a hard time justifying that.
Are there one or so in particular that we could talk about?
Well, I think the responsibilities are greater in some of these. It's just me, I just don't see it.
Right. They more than likely are greater responsibility than assistant street commissioner, but currently they're being paid even less than the assistant street commissioner. And what we're requesting is that they at least match what the assistant street commissioner's making.
I just don't see the duties being the same, sorry.
I'll just comment on that too, Mr. Taylor. I kind of feel more, I think when we were discussing the budget as a council, we felt like 3% or across the board. So I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that, the 3 changes as well, personally.
I mean, it's looking at it at a macro or a micro level. I mean, it would be a lot easier to just say 3% across the board. But when you're looking at each individual position, that's where we're coming from, where we have to take a look at it.
And we had with the job unemployment rate and trying to recruit the most qualified candidates, we had a very difficult time trying to find an assistant to the economic development position. We had offered a position, he declined because his company offered him more money. We had to start from scratch. Luckily, we've got a really great employee now in that position, but he did take a pay cut to take the position with us. And want to stay competitive with our other communities and try to stay somewhat competitive with the private industry as well, and feel that the duties of really the 3 positions, as I mentioned, in economic development planning and facilities monitor, or at least the equivalent of the assistant street commissioner, if not more so. And I guess I want to ask a question, if I may. Are you, Mr. Taylor, feeling that their duties are maybe not as equivalent or more?
I just think, where do we stop? I mean, the argument to me is, okay, which assistant's worth more pay, this one or that one? And it seems like every time we come to a budget, that always stands out as we got to be equal. And I don't think the responsibilities are equal. I don't have an example, but I could give you one in 2 weeks, but right now I don't have one.
I just wondered.
I mean, and there are department assistant directors that do make less. We're not here asking for an increase to the, sorry not to pick on human resources, but the human resources assistant director, we're not here making that case. We have looked at them, across the board and individually, and that's where we had landed, where we felt it was equivalent.
But I think if I can back up Mr. Taylor a little bit, I think what he's saying and what I would agree with is, I'm assuming when you asked for the original 10 salary adjustments, I'm sure you could justify each one of them, right? You wouldn't have asked for them if you couldn't justify them. But to what Mr. Taylor is saying, and I would tend to agree, is where do you draw that line? at this point in time. You know, like I said, I think we got comfortable with the original policy of either 3% or the pay adjustment. So I don't know. I mean, don't mean to speak for you, Mr. Taylor, but I feel that's where you're coming from, and I would agree.
Any other questions?
Mr. President, just one. So I'm just trying to clarify. You're looking at these from a job description, responsibility perspective, and trying to put them in a category compared to the assistant street commissioner, or at least from a dollar perspective. But you're saying the market, economic development, use that as an example, out in the market, it will command some range, correct? And you're trying to get this position in that range.
Correct.
And this is what you think you need to do to get there.
It would be a start, yes.
Same would be true with the assistant director for planning.
Correct. And the facilities manager.
If I might, I think the directors and, well, here or not, but I think they assumed that we would stay on the path we have in the past and only ask for, let's say, $3,000 on a salary, economic development. Expecting then to also get that. So when you didn't get that, they would have gone $5,000 if they didn't know that they were going to be exempt from the 3% cost of living. They were being conservative, thinking that they were going to get the cost of living as well.
Johnson.
I understand what you're saying. I actually agree with it in this particular instance, I think. So I support what you guys are saying.
And thank you for the opportunity to discuss it with you. We appreciate that.
Additional questions or comments for Mr. Cook or Ms. Ritter?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Okay, moving right along here. Ordinance 37-10-18. Council to consider ordinance 37-10-18, a salary ordinance for elected officials for the city of Noblesville for 2019.
Motion to introduce.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Ms. Lees.
Good evening.
Good evening.
This salary ordinance is for the elected officials of the city. The mayor, the city clerk, and the judge are receiving the 3% COLA that the employees are receiving. We did restructure council pay. I think the last time council pay was studied was in 2004. In keeping with Mr. Spalding trying to eliminate positions that were paid from the wastewater utility and the general fund, and to try to simplify processes a little bit for payroll. Through talking with the Finance Committee and with Mr. Spalding, we've come up with just a yearly general fund salary for council rather than the old monthly that was split between general fund and wastewater. That it was a pretty cumbersome process for payroll. A little farther down, for many years, it has been the custom to pay the president more than the rank and file members. It was decided that it would be a good idea to have a set percentage that the president made more, and currently the president is making, I think, 14.3% more when you do the math, so we just rounded that up to 15%. Same thing was done with the annual payment from wastewater, which you would still receive. We rounded it up from the 28.3% that it is now to a 30%. Just to try to simplify the whole process, make it easier for payroll, make it easier going forward and a little less complicated. The changes we made amount to about a 1.5% increase in council pay. Finance Committee felt that it was better if the council would forego the 3% increase, since this was giving a little bit of an increase in the restructuring. And I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Any questions, Clerk Lees? Seeing none, thank you very much. Move right along to ordinance 38-10-18. Council to consider ordinance 38-10-18, an ordinance for a change of zoning from R1 to R3 and R4 for approximately 125 acres north of 156th Street and west of Summer Road.
Motion to introduce?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Good evening, Ms. Ashelman.
Good evening. Apparently our tech might have gone to sleep.
Can't blame
There we go. Maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, we also need to introduce the next one.
Yep, I apologize.
Sorry.
I had notes to do that. We'll go ahead and undertake these next two together. So we'll introduce a new ordinance 39-10-18. Council to consider ordinance 39-10-18, an ordinance for a change of zoning from R3 and R4 to R3, R4 PD, and the adoption of a preliminary development plan and ordinance for approximately 124 acres to be known as Brooks Farm Plan Development, north of 156th Street and west of Summer Road.
Motion to introduce?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Once again, Denise Ashelman.
The site is at the northwest corner of 156th and Summer Road. This is the Marion Development and Chapel Woods and Logan's Point on the east side. The property is currently zoned R1. The request is to rezone to an R3, R4 PD. There are 3 different product types for a total of 319 residential units. There would be approximately 24 acres rezoned to R4 to allow for the attached villa project, or I'm sorry, attached villas product, similar to what you've seen at Chapel Villas as well as Pebblebrook Villas. And there would be a total of 76 units in that 24 acres, or a total of 38 lots. The remainder of the project, which is approximately 100 acres, would then be zoned R3, resulting in 243 single-family lots. There are as there are 3 product types, the plan development actually calls out 3 different areas. Areas A and B are the 2 shades of green. Area A is a lighter green. That product is actually going to be smaller lots with a product line from Lennar. The area B is a slightly larger size lot with a product line from Pulte. The majority of our discussion at the Plan Commission level was regarding the original proposal by the developer. The developer originally asked for a 20-foot front yard setback in areas A and B. Also in C, planning staff took issue with it, and so did some of the members of Plan Commission in the single-family areas. The reason we didn't take issue with it in area C, the villa product, if you're not familiar with it, has a side-load garage component, and because of that, their garages were not right on that 20-foot setback line, so there's plenty of room to park a car in a driveway, and that is our main concern with the 20-foot setback. 20-foot setback, a parking space is 20 feet. You could make the argument, well, you can park a car in a 20-foot parking space, but you're also not parking with the nose of your car right at something you paid a lot of money for, which is your garage door. So you have a tendency to keep a little bit of space and separation. And what we get is a lot of the tail end of the cars hanging across the sidewalk. So because of that, the rezoning ordinance actually passed at the August Plan Commission, but the plan development ordinance was continued. In that time frame, the petitioner came back with an amendment to their plan development ordinance and did amend the front setback to 25 feet for areas A and B, so those areas in the different shades of green. And because of that, then the Plan Commission forwarded that plan development and also the rezone onto you with a favorable recommendation. There is a full list of the waivers requested for the project in your Plan Commission report that was included in your packet. We did just want to provide some further clarification on one of the waivers. It is for perimeter buffer yards. They are providing perimeter buffer yards here both along 156th Street and also along Summer Road. The document lists that they're waiving, or they're not providing the buffers along Marion, which is this north boundary, and Chapel Woods. While that is true, it's only partially true. Marion is a project from the same developer. They also don't have a buffer, so they would actually just abut each other. There is actually a tree line along the shared property line with Chapel Villas. And as part of that, the petitioner is actually proposing the inclusion of a tree preservation easement, similar to what you saw with the Timbers project last year, so that they can try to maintain this tree line here. And the tree, it's not a standard like 25 feet. The areas where the tree line is thicker, the easement would get larger to encompass the whole tree line, and it gets smaller where there may only be 10 or 15 feet of trees in the area. Staff, as I said, Plan Commission did forward this to you with a favorable recommendation, and planning staff also recommends approval of the project. Yes.
Ashman, noticing then on the north end of that property, the tree line that would be adjacent to Marion, are they proposing doing the preservation easement along there as well?
They are not proposing the preservation easement, but I will let them address if they're planning to keep the trees in that area. It's not something we've discussed. Marion doesn't have any homeowners adjacent, whereas Chapel Woods does.
Right.
And that was one of their main concerns. I will be honest, I really haven't talked to anyone out of Chapel Woods, which really surprises me, as I know plenty of people that live there, and they've been relatively quiet through this process.
Additional questions of staff? Would you like to speak? Pardon, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, members of the City Council. For the record, my name is Steve Harden. I'm a partner in the law firm of Faegre Baker Daniels. I'm pleased to be representing Mark Gradison and his company, Gradison Land Development. We did have a neighbors meeting, and we had quite a good turnout from most of the people from Chapel Woods. We had it at the model home there at the clubhouse at Marion, so it was very convenient for them, and they were mostly interested in timing. They liked to see what the home plans were, the price point was appropriate. There was a couple of them that asked us to take a look at the tree preservation, and so that's what Mark Gradison's team did, and that's why we came up and we added that. You'll see in the packet, that was one of the things we added, was the tree preservation area. The area you were asking about, Mrs. Wiles, is actually within this development. The tree line's not along the north side, so this tree line that cuts right through here is in the middle of our development. Okay. The homework that we had from the City Council back in June, I don't know if you had a chance to look through your packet of materials that we provided you, but I'll just go through those kind of key things that you all asked us to take a look at, and we'll walk through those here. So back when we were here before, in June, the council asked us, first off, could we find a way to be able to add additional paired villas? So back in June, we had 46. In the updated plan, as we went to the Planning Commission, we added additional paired villas along the south part of the project, so we now have 74. So the team was able to do that. We were also, asked, is there a way to be able to add some variety along that western street? And so the engineering team then took that as a cue to do that and added this curvilinear component to the that streetscape. So we were able to say yes to that, and we were able to accomplish that as well. And then we were also asked, could we provide some more details on what the perimeter landscape and an entrance plan would look like? So we did that as well at the Plan Commission. You have that in your packet as well, that details the 4 to 7 foot perimeter buffers, mounds that are going to go along the perimeter here that you can see. And then we have the various landscaping that we're going to have as well. We were asked to show what the entranceway would look like, so that's in your packet as well. There's 2 entrances, the 2 similar monumentations. And then really the rest of the edits that we have in the packet of materials for you that show the changes to the PUD ordinance since we were here back in June were in response primarily from staff comments, Plan Commission comments, and neighbor comments. So we think we've addressed all of the homework that we had both from the neighbors, the staff, the Plan Commission, and the council. And we had a unanimous favorable recommendation from the Plan Commission. So we respectfully request your favorable consideration. If you had any additional homework for us, we could come back, but if you didn't have any, we would respectfully request your consideration of approval tonight. Thank you very much.
Comments, questions?
One question, this
Mr.
is
O'Connor.
probably trivia at its highest. That the map you just had on there, Mr. Harden, there's a little curve out there and it looks like a residential property. I'm just curious who that land, is that the Brooks's home?
No, sir, that's the Sparks.
Sparks. Okay, thanks.
Yes, sir.
I kept trying, I couldn't remember right here. Yeah. The carve out.
Additional comments or questions of Mr. Harden? Good. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you in a few weeks. Moving right along to new ordinance 40-10-18. Council to consider ordinance 40-10-18 and ordinance amending ordinance 62-12-95 and all amendments thereto for text amendments to the Unified Development Ordinance regarding the Architectural Review Board.
Motion to introduce?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Ms. Reed.
I'm going to say a few introductory comments here with a cough drop in my throat, hopefully helping. For the record, I do not have what Jeff has. He has laryngitis, I have a sinus infection, so it's budget season, I haven't been hanging out with him, just to clarify. So this Architectural Review Board amendments, you all have heard about this for what seems like eons to me, and probably Baggy as well, who I know is in the audience, and several developers. What we have tried to do as a staff is work with the Builders Association of Greater Indianapolis, taking some time and some step backs, hearing originally what your feedback was, taking a professional stab at what we had going on, and then now finessing it with their input. I know that the Architectural Review Board has been in place for several years, but it is the opinion of staff, and I hope the majority of council that have served on it, to be sort of an ineffective way of making change and getting quality. So from our opinion right now, it's sort of an arbitrary process. It changes with each person that sits on the board could be month to month if I have Caleb sub in for me. So the goal of this process is to streamline approvals and to also make it more transparent to the builders of what our baseline minimum is. So we're giving them the minimum, and as they come through with PDs, they plan to, I hope, many of them will say, if they speak tonight, but hopefully they will show us how they not only meet but can exceed the minimums in certain areas based on each individual project at a PUD level. So what you've seen on paper, just note that that will likely change by the time the PUD process is over for each one of these new subdivisions. And we've tried to do our best. I know that there will likely be about 4 or 5 comments you'll hear this evening from at least one developer, potentially from Baggy as well. So we haven't fully agreed on everything, but I think that we've gotten about 90% there, if not 95%. So to me, that's been a pretty big feat, and want to thank everybody who's been involved in the audience as well. So I'll let Joyce Ann do a quick presentation, and then hopefully, if it doesn't take forever, I'll still be here to answer questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Yelton? Oh, Mr. O'Connor?
No.
He's just kidding. He's tormenting you.
Were you offering to serve on ARB forever?
No, you need to take care of the sinus infection.
Yeah.
I'm on antibiotics.
Good.
So I'm good.
Ms. Yelton, you're up.
For the record, I'm on antibiotics.
Okay, basically,
doing a little bit of comparison, and again, of what we were always varying as far as at the ARB, we continually always varied things such as the corner breaks. That was roughly anywhere between, on a two-story structure, 66% of the time, we varied that requirement. Same thing on porch requirements. That was on a two-story at 63%. Masonry percentage on basically both the primary architectural plane was at 82%. Roof pitch, we only varied that roughly 24% of the time. Roof ridge lines varied anywhere between 40 to 76%, depending on whether it was a single-story structure or a two-story structure. Number of windows, again, basically varied from 35 to 45% based on a single-story or a multi-story structure. Window treatment basically got varied 50% of the time on both structures. And garage door percentage on the primary architectural plane, again, got varied anywhere between 63 to 42%, depending on whether it was a single-story or a multi-story structure. Again, what we have tried to do is basically get to a point where we can all agree on basically standards. And I'm just going to quickly go through our ARB standards. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. For instance, we basically have set roof ridge lines at being a minimum of 3 on the front facade. We've got 11 corner breaks throughout the entire house that would need to be provided. Windows on a single level dwelling would be 2 on each facade. If it's a multi-story, it has to be a minimum of 3 windows on each facade. If you have a corner lot, let's say if you have a lot that's less than, we're going to say 48 feet in width, the side facades could be reduced to just a minimum of 1 window. Window wells do not ever count. A service door for a garage entry with a window in it would count towards your window requirements, and patio doors would also count towards the window requirements. Window treatment would take a nominal 1x4 applied to a header, the seal, and the jambs. Obviously, there are other window treatments that could be provided. We also allowed a freeze board to be permitted as one of the items that enhanced the window. Garage door percentages, we basically looked at all of the garage door percentages on homes that we have approved, and that's where we came up with these percentages. So if you had a front load garage on a single-story level, a single level dwelling, you could cover up 30% for a 2-car. It would be 40% for a 3-car. If it's a multi-level, it would be 20% for a 2-car and 30% for a 3-car if they're front load. We changed the porch requirement from being you had to have a porch that extended out 6 feet to basically a 30-square-foot porch at a minimum. We've required the roof pitch to be at a 612. Overhangs are still at 12 inches from the adjacent architectural plane, excluding gutters, and that's prior to any cladding materials. The number of siding materials that we would require would be 3 distinct siding materials or patterns on a front facade, 2 distinct siding materials or patterns on what is considered a primary facade, and 1 distinct siding material with a trim break could be on a secondary facade. If you provided 75% of the front facade as being brick or masonry brick or stone, then no additional siding materials would be required on that elevation. On that front elevation. A single-story structure would only require 2 distinct siding materials or patterns, and brick, stone, and cementous board are permitted materials, including vinyl siding if vinyl siding is at a 0.050 inch thickness. We also have in there an anti-monotony clause and landscaping. And we also talk a little bit about historical styles and how we would be judging those, and that's based on a book. And with that, I will ask if anybody has any questions.
Questions of Mr. Johnson?
If you said it, I missed it. The percentages you gave us that of the percentages of waivers that were made, what period did that span?
I want to say 2000, I was going to say 2005 forward.
A gut feeling, because you're there in the war zone every day, has that gotten less in the last couple of years, or has it been pretty consistent?
It's been pretty consistent. It's not gotten any less in the last few years.
Yeah, because I know that's one of the things that Brian and we've talked about is trying to do fewer and fewer of those waivers, exceptions.
I personally feel like our waivers have increased over the last. If I look back at the history of ARB and
Brian, you guys speak.
if I look back at the history of ARB, and Joyce Ann was here this whole time, ARB was a good thing when it was run correctly. Excuse me, Sarah, but Sarah had never been involved in it before, and Christy Langley hadn't been involved in it before, and Joyce Ann was somewhat limited. Steve Huntley ran it. It was adopted by a council probably 20 years ago, and when I sat on it 14 years ago, it was run very well and did a lot of good things. I think it has slowly worked its way backwards and not doing everything that it was doing. My concern is that I don't want to have an ARB meeting in our council meeting.
Yeah.
And I'm not so sure that this document doesn't stop that from happening. So that's a concern I have now. Sarah is getting ready to rebut that.
Okay,
and yell at me
I'm
for
just going to say a couple things real quick. Sorry, I can't help myself. A couple of things really quickly. One is that what we've learned by several long hour meetings with the group of people behind me is that the way that people live out of their homes has changed. So a lot of the way that they're building homes now, the sizes they're building homes now, they are very market target. So they're targeting specific people with specific types of homes. So people live out of the fronts and rears of their homes. Some of the things that people are waiving all of the time are these siding, the sides of the homes, the number of windows, the number of corner breaks, the things you don't see when you're driving 25 or probably more like 40 down a subdivision street. And then the other thing I think has changed quite a bit is the level of, I'm trying to figure out the right way to say this, the level of interest and involvement that council, I believe, has had at least since I've been in this position, is a lot more in-depth and hands-on than my past experience. And so I feel like you all are doing a really good job of reading every single one of these PDs. I mean, we're talking mailboxes, we're talking entrance signage, we're talking landscape buffers and preservation easements, and in many jurisdictions, those types of comments are left to staff, and you guys, I believe, are doing a really good job in digging into the weeds. So I feel like together as a team with staff and council and even administration, if we have these minimum requirements, we have the baseline to be able to ask them, what are you giving us above and beyond what our minimums are? Which I feel is how many other communities are approaching PDs. So even though we have this set of minimum standards here, what they're proposing by the time they get to you is they're showing you how they're exceeding those, and that's what's giving you the availability to say whether or not you feel you want to vote on those.
I don't think that's true. I don't think they're exceeding anything. They're meeting our minimum along with getting the waivers for the things they don't want to meet. And they're living out of the fronts and the backs of their homes because the homes are so close together, you can't live out of the sides of them, and there's no reason to have windows. So, you know, and you're going to get 9 different opinions. You saw that when you did the survey from the council.
Yep, I know.
So it is what it is, and you know, I just happen to be very opinionated on it, but
that's okay.
I don't want to have an ARB meeting in a council meeting.
Yeah, and I feel like I feel like the way the process should be working is that if staff is recommending something for approval, once these standards are legit standards instead of guidelines, that our approval or recommendation for approval should hopefully, you could be able to take that into consideration as you're looking at these in the future, whereas in the past, because they're guidelines, I don't feel like that standard has been set for you to be able to take what staff recommends as a serious okay, planning is okay with it, so let's go.
Then I think council needs to pay a lot of attention to this, because this is a document that that we have instructed you to follow.
That's right.
And you put the document together. So I think, we need to pay a lot of attention to what it says and take a hard look at it and get that feedback back to planning staff to figure out. But I hate to abolish ARB if we're not going in a forward position.
Mr. Boyce.
So, as someone who served on ARB 3 times, then I can say that eliminating it in some ways would be great. But I do have some, and I also am for anything that's going to help the developers and builders, because I think streamlining this process is something necessary. But I do have some of the same concerns Brian has. I feel like we have not done the job that I would like in setting out what we want Noblesville to look like and what we want the developers to do in order to make it that in a succinct way so that it happens. When they come in front of us in this forum, I feel like whether they meet the minimum standards or not, which I can't remember one in quite a while that has met all of the minimums. I think that I think calling them guidelines would be a joke, honestly. I think they are suggestions, and that's how this council has looked at them. Because I mean, I'm not trying to joke when I say that. I honestly do not remember a planned development that met all of the requirements. And how can we call it a requirement, not a suggestion, if we're saying you have to meet this? I mean, am I wrong? In my 12 years, do you guys remember ever doing one that had met every requirement? So I guess I just am concerned taking out the ARB. I'm afraid that we're going to put ourselves in worse jeopardy with that. And I'm not sure that's true. I'm concerned on all sides, because I definitely see the benefits both from all of us with not having ARB and to the builders. So I'd like that, but I also want to figure out some way where we are telling them exactly what we want and we're getting it. So if this is it and what's that, but I think we've got to follow those guidelines then when they bring PDs, because PDs don't have to meet the requirements if we vote for them, yes, anyway.
And I think, the goal of our department would be to draw that line in the sand so that we at least have that line, so that we have something solid to move forward with. Because right now, as you said, they're suggestions or guidelines at best. And for me, waving a piece of suggested paper in front of them saying, you're not even meeting these guys, that's not giving them any encouragement to
And the
move
flip
forward.
side of that is you approving that. When they go to ARB, they haven't been to Plan Commission yet.
Correct.
They haven't spent is there attorneys here? They haven't spent the
Yeah,
hundreds
there's
of
a lot.
thousands of dollars with their attorney
That's
to get
true.
the plan, go through Plan Commission, and then get to the council, and then the council beat it up because they don't agree with what you've told the developer that we agree with. And so therefore it gets kicked out maybe, or maybe it doesn't, but it becomes another process. And I think that's part of what ARB helped to do, was it eliminated a lot of that. It still gets beat up a little bit because there's a road here and we missed having a house or something, and Rick's pretty good at that.
It
But
depends
it
on which
doesn't
people
go
like
through.
it on ARB, I guess, maybe.
It doesn't go through that. I mean, we sit in ARB and we go through
Oh, yeah.
plans this thick.
I'm an alum there.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a member.
Yeah.
I'm not
Mr. Johnson.
So I think Brian and Mark, what I'm hearing and agree with is set the minimum standards and don't bring us any waivers. Bring us information about how much more you're going to put on top of the minimums. Is that right?
I think that's right. I just think we need to make sure that
That's
what she
exactly
has
what we
written
want.
in here is the minimum standard, or the minimum standard.
Otherwise, if you don't do that, and Mr. Harden, you represent people all the time, but if you don't do that, you're always going to be getting asked for some kind of waiver.
And I'm going to throw this out there because if I don't, someone else will say it behind me, but there are always special circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully those are a little bit far and few between. But there will always be that unique situation that's some mixed-use development that that needs.
I think we've met that in
One
the past, though, with other developments that have had those special circumstances.
Yeah, so I mean, it's looking at each development on its own merits compared back to the standards, and then if there is one section of a development that needs a waiver particularly, let's evaluate that one-on-one and hopefully not everyone.
Taylor.
Well, I think I can relate to what we're talking about to this last development tonight. It had 10 waivers on it.
Yeah.
So I do have concerns about
that's the
not
perfect
having ARB. I've sat on it as well, but now whether we ended up with 10, I haven't went through and counted, but that's a perfect example. We're sitting up here without ARB, and we got 10 waivers. So now we, as a council, are gonna have to go through every one of those. I mean, unless some of them don't have a problem with it, but I'm gonna have a problem with most of them.
And I do feel like every time we have a mixed-use community that's a large development, we're gonna have these circumstances that come up as well. But I hope that where we grow and what we grow into in the future will be a lot more clearly defined before we get there.
Johnson?
Yeah, and I think if we stay strong on those standards and basically, avoid any possibility of some of these waivers, instead of the developer going, okay, here's my piece of land, how can I get what I want on there, and these are the waivers I'll need to do that, they would look at it like, okay, these are the requirements, how do I make this fit on here?
That would be
great.
And so, I would say some do that. Some do that.
Mr. Hampton.
I too have been on ARB, I think last year with Brian, and I truthfully, our goal is to get the best product for our city so that it looks the best and fits what we're trying to do. And I hate to lose a level of screening, I really do. As much as it's difficult, and I remember digging through those things, and they were much longer meetings than we had ever anticipated, but it was a level of screening that helped get the end product that we were searching for.
Right.
And if we can do both, if we actually stick to the standards, that's where it starts.
Some comments, Mr. Taylor, back to you.
Well, and let's not forget, even setting on ARB, that we've missed a few.
Oh, yeah.
So how many are we gonna miss if we're here?
And that's, I mean,
I
see what you're saying.
I missed one, and I hate it today.
We don't miss those anymore.
I know I was part of that. And so if we're gonna take that element away,
And I know which one it is, because I've heard you drive about
God, it's terrible.
Mr. Combs, there are two individuals from the public that would like to speak. At this time, we'll go ahead and call whoever's going to represent Pulte. It just says Pulte Group, so. And then Kate Collins with Aggie, you'll be next. Name and address for the record, please. Thank you.
Sure. My name's Caitlin Dofer, Manager of Land Planning and Entitlement with Pulte. Address is 1159 North Meridian, Suite 530, Carmel, Indiana. We just want to thank staff for all their work during this. It has been a lot of meetings and a lot of long hours discussing this. And they've been really productive meetings. And coming to this point, we really only have a few outstanding issues that we'd really like to fine tune. And these really come down to, like Sarah said, streamlining the process, making it so developers can provide plans that do conform to the standards that are there, and then also allow the home buyers some flexibility to have the add-ons that they want, the plan that they want, without having to spend money in certain places and then having to choose that over other places. So during our conversations with staff, one of the topics that often came up was, how do these changes affect the home buyer? And then how does it really fit in with the housing analysis? So one of the slides that I saw that I thought was applicable was talking about today's home buyers. Many of today's home buyers place a significant value on neighborhood amenities, even about the housing stock itself, or even above the housing stock itself. Policies that allow older neighborhoods to evolve become critical to addressing today's demand. And then 55% believe that the qualities of the neighborhood the house is in, including the shops and amenities nearby, would be more important than the qualities of the home itself. People have changed how they live in their homes, just as Sarah said. the priorities have changed. They want a little more flexibility to choose how to spend their money where they want to. The two largest consumer groups for housing, millennials and baby boomers, are going to be the most budget conscious when it comes to home buying, creating additional standards for windows, corner breaks, and building materials ultimately creates extra cost on the home buyer. It's requiring extra windows in a floor plan that didn't have the minimum number of windows on the side, or requiring an add-on or a garage bump to create the corner break requirement, or requiring a certain number of building materials because the home backs up to a common space. For a resident or future resident of Noblesville, this puts an unnecessary strain on their budget and ultimately becomes a tipping point for home buyers. And then ultimately that could decide whether or not they can afford living in Noblesville. It's possible that home buyers select to include these items, but why should not that be their own choice? We agree with the intent of the standards. However, by loosening the restrictions, it could provide more flexibility on the homeowner. Specifically, the corner breaks, we agree with the aggregate. 11 corner breaks we can do, but bringing down the number of corner breaks on the side would allow a little more flexibility for the home plans. Number of windows, again, we agree with the aggregate. The aggregate of 8 on a single level and an aggregate of 12 on a multiple level, but then bringing down that requirement to a minimum of, windows, to a minimum of 1 on a single level home, and then a minimum of 2 on a multiple level home. And then the vinyl requirement, we did some research on this. I know the minimum requested is 0.050, and then looking up manufacturers in the area, we found what was available in that thickness, and then along with other thickness, and then the colors available. We know anti-monotony and streetscape is important. So here is some of our findings.
If you could wrap up just with time, please, that'd be great. Thank you.
So the 0.046 provides the widest array of color options. This is where you get the really rich tones, and then as you go up in thickness, the color variations lessen. 0.048, you get down to the beiges, and then only one manufacturer offers 0.050. And these are the color options. And that is all I have. If Joel wants to come up and discuss more about vinyl. Yeah, oh, okay, we're good. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time. Kate Collins is Baggy. Address for the record, please. Good evening.
Hi, thank you, President Jensen. Councilors, for the record, Kate Collins with the Builders Association of Greater Indianapolis. Our address is 6510 Telecom Drive, Suite 185 in Indianapolis. So first, I just wanted to thank everybody, thank your amazing staff who has worked with us more than a year. I think that's, I'm sure it's been more than a year. I think I was before Plan Commission no fewer than 3 times in the last 8 months to kind of work through some of these details. Just generally and philosophically speaking, as an association, we certainly support having some clear guidelines to work through. I think it's easier for us to understand what the expectations are and to meet your expectations and move to ensure that we deliver quality products here for Noblesville. You know, as Caitlin mentioned, I won't get into specifics, had a couple items that we're still trying to, work through with staff. I will also say that, during this 1.5-year process and multiple work sessions, one of the great benefits was that builders were able to provide floor plan, real-life examples of what would or wouldn't be permitted under the draft. So they were able to walk through and see actual elevations of things that have been approved that have been very well liked and well received here in the city, and whether or not those plans would continue to work and would not. So we were able to make adjustments. So what you see in your final draft is a result of all of those iterations of work. Also would want to make available to you should you have questions. I know Sarah is available to you, but if you have questions about how we landed on those things from a builder's perspective, certainly happy to get with you on any specific questions that you may have between now and then. Like I said, or as Sarah mentioned, 90% of the way there. We definitely want to ensure that we have a lot of flexibility as our buyer pool continues to evolve. Try to focus on the housing study that you all commissioned here recently and make sure we deliver those types of products. We will have 46% more senior citizens in Indiana by 2030. So wanting to make sure that they can continue to live in that maintenance-free lifestyle. That's why vinyl is particularly important in this ordinance, as that is the maintenance-free option. So thank you again. Thanks for staff for working with us, and we hope that you consider this. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you. Additional comments for staff or for the good of the cause? Seeing none, thank you very much. We'll see you in a few weeks. Moving on to miscellaneous, number 1, council to consider approval of the 2019 meeting schedule. Clerk Lees.
Something quick and easy. This is our yearly approval of your meeting dates for 2019. Would point out that in May and November, we had a choice between having a slightly inconvenient date near a holiday, but if we moved up the dates by a week, then we conflict with election days. So it seemed the inconvenience with the holiday was the better choice. And other than that, I would just ask for your approval of the dates, and the planning staff will be very happy because then they can set their meeting dates.
So moved. Okay. Been moved and second. All those in favor? 8-0. Moving right along. Miscellaneous number 2, council to consider approval of settlement agreement. Good evening, Mr. Howard.
Good evening. This is an agreement that we worked on for quite some time to resolve some issues as CDBG recipient and other issues. It is before you for your review and approval and instructions for the mayor and authorizing the mayor to sign the agreement.
Additional questions, Mr. Howard?
Mr. President.
Mr. O'Connor.
I would move that we approve the settlement agreement and provide the mayor with the appropriate authority to sign any and all documents as submitted.
Second.
Been moved and second. All those in favor? 8-0. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to council comments. I have 3 council comments I'd like to make. 3.
Really?
First of all, I know, sorry. 3. First of all, coming up on November 13th before our regular scheduled meeting at 5:30, we'll be doing a joint meeting with the school board here at City Hall at 5:30. We'll provide dinner, and Clerk Lees will put that on our calendar for November 13th. Second of all, I will just point out by the next meeting on the 23rd, we should have a new council member as the caucus is scheduled for the 22nd of October. So just a notice for you there. And finally, pursuant to our discussion on the Levinson project, I know one of our biggest concerns for the council member was the architecture standards and the review of that going forward. That development agreement called for a council appointee on that review panel. It allowed the president to make that, and I've asked Mr. Taylor to serve in that capacity. So I wanted to inform the council that Mr. Taylor will serve as the architecture review member from the council for the Levinson project moving forward. Additional comments? Seeing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us.